Okay, good evening. Welcome. We are going to run until 8:15, just to alert you, that's our schedule. Each of our speakers will speak for 20 minutes, and then we will have discussion. My name is Sanjay Reddy. I am associate professor in the economics department at the New School for Social Research. I am chairing this evening's session. I'm not actually the discussant as advertised, but rather the chair. Let me very briefly introduce our four very distinguished speakers after saying a word of motivation about this evening's discussion, and then I will turn it over to them. They are the founts of wisdom this evening. I take our purpose today to be, in very broad terms, to find a theoretical or intellectual anchor with which to understand the world in which we live. We're, as all of you know, living in a very extraordinary moment in which a long period of triumphalism has been ended. And what we face now is really a crisis of legitimacy of the intellectual frameworks which have been used to justify the order which is now in crisis. And so naturally, all of us are looking for better ways to understand the situation, to understand the world, and to find ways to change it, not merely to understand it. I think it's in that spirit that Akhil Bilgrami, the director of the Heyman Center for the Humanities, framed this evening's discussion as one about Marx or Keynes or ellipsis, question mark. That, I think, is meant to be an open invitation to consider all the different possible alternative ways that we might reason, with Marx and Keynes being two towering figures who, of course, have stood over the last century and offer us some guidance, perhaps, in this regard. Or at least that's what I think we will find out this evening with greater clarity. Very briefly, we'll proceed in alphabetical order by last name. Therefore, the first speaker will be Duncan Foley, my colleague at the New School, who is the Leo Model Professor of Economics at the New School for Social Research. He, as many of you will know, is a very distinguished economist to have worked in the Marxian tradition, but also in many other traditions, and is one of the few economists really to bridge very technical and innovative, in particular innovative forms of technical research in economics and the classical political economy, in particular the Marxian tradition. He's worked on too many topics for me to briefly summarize, theoretical and applied, so I won't attempt that. Professor Foley will be followed by David Harvey, the Distinguished Professor of Anthropology at the Graduate Center of CUNY, the City University of New York, who needs no introduction for almost all of you. He is, I understand, among the 20 most cited authors in the humanities worldwide and the world's most cited academic geographer. As many of you will know, he's also closely associated with the introduction of Marxian analysis, or the reintroduction and reinvigoration of Marxian analysis in the social sciences generally and in geography in particular. And, of course, with the critique of neoliberalism, the definition and critique of neoliberalism as a concept. Professor Harvey will be followed by Professor Perry Mehrling, my former colleague at Barnard College of Columbia University. Professor Mehrling, as many of you who have studied with him here will know, is a very innovative thinker on finance and financialization of the world economy. He is also a very distinguished historian of economic thought who has written two very important books in that regard, The Money Interest and the Public Interest, American Monetary Thought, 1920 to 1970, and his intellectual biography of Fisher Black, one of the architects of modern finance, called Fisher Black and the Revolutionary Idea of Finance. And most recently, as we will hear, he's working on a very important book, which I've had the privilege to see in draft to some degree, which is called The New Lombard Street, which offers a very I think, important perspective and unique perspective on the current crisis. I've come to think that Perry is one of the few people who really understands the innards of the current crisis, and so I feel very privileged that he can speak to us today. And finally, we will have Professor Prabhat Patnaik, who is a distinguished visitor at Columbia for all too short a period. As many of you will know, he's one of India's leading social scientists, and indeed one of the leading social scientists in the South and in the world, who is a professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning in the School of Social Sciences at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and also currently vice chairman of the planning board in the Indian state of Kerala. So very much someone who is bridging theory and practice, or praxis. I won't take up more of your time. Let me, without further ado, draw on or call on Duncan Foley, and please welcome him warmly. Thank you.
Well, I mentioned to my students at the New School this afternoon where I was giving a talk, and I mentioned this meeting, and I said, if you're not a victim of complete crisis burnout, you might be interested in coming. There's been an awful lot of discussion about the crisis and about its implications, and there might in fact be a little bit of diminishing returns. Perry was just saying that the crisis, he'd had a good crisis in the sense that people say they had a good war, that he's having a good time speaking and writing and about it. I thought maybe I'd divide my remarks into two parts, or three parts really. One is to discuss just a little bit the very broad issue that's hinted at in the title of the panel, which is what kinds of changes, if any, we might, and in what dimensions we might expect changes in the world economy and in the big national economies, especially the United States economy, as the fallout or consequence of this crisis. Second, I'd like to talk a little bit about changes. I won't probably talk very much about finance and the specific issues of financial regulation and financial organization, because I think other people on the panel have more to say about that than I do. But I would like to talk a little bit about the changed world picture as a result of this crisis. And finally, I'd like to just say a couple of words about the issue that Sanjay raised, which is the crisis of legitimacy for ideological presentations of world capitalism and what we might expect to see coming out of that. So let me start with a point that I made at the Historical Materialism Conference back in January, which is that in fact crisis periods are not necessarily particularly productive periods for progressive political and social change. The connection between crisis and political and social change is very complex and very nonlinear, and it's equally, it spurs non-progressive change as much as it does, or it can, as much as it does progressive political change. So I sometimes wonder a little bit about the high excitement level among left-wing students and social scientists about crisis. I mean, it certainly is exciting, but it's, as I said at the Historical Materialism Conference, what the left gets out of a crisis period is pretty much what it brings into the crisis period, because the crisis period itself is not going to magically change a lot of people's minds or produce a lot of new ideas. One striking contrast of the current crisis period with, say, the 1930s is that in the 1930s, I reviewed recently the debates between Keynes and Hayek in the 1930s over approaches to solving the problems of the world economy in the Great Depression. One of the issues that hovered over that debate very markedly was a question of whether countries like Britain and to some degree the United States would in fact continue to depend on basic capitalist institutions, wage labor, free enterprise, an open investment market, to organize the division of labor. In part, that was because the Soviet Union was a vigorous presence in the 1930s, not, I think, very well understood by many people in the West, but still thought of by many people as a viable alternative. I would say that is not true today. That is, I don't really see anyone who seriously is thinking that this episode is going to very rapidly bring about a fundamental change in the basically capitalist institutions that are organizing world production and the world division of labor. So in that sense, I think probably Marx is not on the cards as a direct alternative. One of the reasons for that, is that we haven't done enough homework, frankly. We don't have a very clear agenda for a fundamental change of the institutions organizing the social division of labor. When Marx, in Marx's lifetime, when he was working with the First International Working Men's Party movement, I think he had a rather clear idea, both politically and economically and socially, of what revolutionary change in European capitalism would mean. He, I think, saw European history in the 19th century as having a lot of continuity with the French Revolution and as having a very good likelihood that class struggle-based revolutionary movements would play a major role in the political reorganization of Europe. And I think he also had a rather simple idea of what socialism meant, which was to, as much as possible, to replace markets and the kind of Wild West atmosphere of the 19th century Victorian laissez-faire capitalism with some kind of central direction and central organization of production. I don't think those, I don't find those ideas unrealistic for the 19th century. I think at the point where Marx was trying to intervene, they were not, they were quite relevant ideas. History did not turn out that way for a variety of reasons. And instead, the revolutionary impulse, such as it was in the 20th century, tended to move away from Europe and to peripheral economies, particularly Russia and China. And that is led to the situation that we find ourselves in today. How about Keynes? Well, I also am personally somewhat doubtful that despite the immense nostalgia that seems to be present among my economics colleagues for what they now call the golden age of capitalism, which was what I remember as the horrible 1950s and 60s, when I was growing up and feeling very restless and upset about issues in U.S. society like racism, inequality, the Cold War, the military-industrial complex, and so forth. Now that seems to have been transformed in many people's mind into what people think of as a golden age of Keynesian capitalism. I'm not so sure I even agree with that about the economic and financial side of it. And certainly there's a nostalgia for that and a feeling that if we could just get back to the framework of financial regulation that came out of the New Deal, perhaps you could stabilize in some sense the U.S. economy. I really don't think that's exactly on the cards either. Or if it is on the cards, I think it has to be understood as a process that would have to take place at a global and not really a national level. Perhaps the other members of the panel will have some remarks to make about that. As far as I can see, there's going to be the financial regulation effort is, as you would expect of bourgeois democracy, largely an exercise in closing what we what we say in English, closing the barn door after the horse has been stolen, that it's not a particularly proactive or particularly imaginative approach to rethinking in any radical or critical way the institutions. What it's an effort to do is scurry around and make the minimal changes that would legitimize the ongoing dominance of financial institutions to the voting publics of the European and North American and to some degrees Japanese societies. Well, what instead of Marx, or Marx or Keynes? What about the ellipsis? I was thinking to myself, gee, maybe the ellipsis is what I ought to talk about here, because that maybe is more upbeat for one thing. Well, first of all, I think we have to understand that what's happening politically in the United States with the high unemployment as the main equilibrating response to the financial crisis is very much exactly what the IMF imposed on all of the other countries that underwent financial crises in the 1990s and earlier in the 2000s. In every case, the IMF imposed, with strong U.S. political backing, imposed austerity programs which had a very strong class gradient to them and forced the costs of adjustment disproportionately onto the weakest and most vulnerable members of the society. And we're now experiencing that in the United States. Will that lead to, what could that lead to? Well, it can obviously lead to a pretty nasty reactionary political movement, which we see the nascent signs of. It may also lead to some strengthening of a kind of a center-left coalition to try to protect some of the conditions of existence of working class and poor people in the United States. Frankly, so far, I would say the signs are that it's mostly a defensive game that is being played by the politicians, and that I don't really expect any major alteration of the distributional workings of U.S. politics and the U.S. economy coming out of this period. There are going to be some big changes. I think one big change is in the relative economic and political importance of the United States and Europe in the world economy. And I don't think this is so much a direct consequence of crisis. That is, that it was the crisis that somehow knocked down the U.S. and Europe relative to other economies. I think it was more a question of a kind of a period of denial and illusion, self-illusion, coming to an end in the crisis, and are realizing that a long-term process of erosion of productive capacity and economic performance had weakened the position of Europe and North America and Japan in the balance of the world economy. So perhaps one question we have is, well, if we're going to go forward within the general framework of capitalist institutions, social and economic institutions, is perhaps the main change going to be that instead of a predominantly European-centered capitalism, European and North American-centered capitalism, we're going to have a predominantly, let's say, Asian-centered world capitalism. I think something like that is in the cards, but those kinds of changes, if you look at the actual numbers, take a very long time to mature and work out. So I wouldn't expect that to be a sudden change, but I think it's going to be a pervasive theme in American political debate, which is something like what the British so memorably and horribly have gone through, coming to terms with the loss of empire and the readjustment to a more normal relationship to the rest of the world. Mr. Timekeeper, five. Okay, so let me spend the last couple of minutes on this question of legitimacy, which I, frankly, until Sanjay mentioned it, I hadn't been thinking about those along those lines as I was coming to the panel. Presumably, the idea here is that capitalism needs an ideology. And the ideology of neoliberal capitalism was a kind of souped-up neoclassical economics with a strong financial element, which involved such ideas as efficient markets hypothesis and the notion that market organization of investment would be self-stabilizing and viable and efficient in social terms. First of all, let's understand that this is largely ideology. This is largely spin. It was always largely spin. The Department of Chicago, the University of Chicago Department of Economics did not, in fact, run the SEC or determine the structure of American financial institutions. It acted to, and its many allies in other parts of the academic world of the United States, acted more as a cheerleader and as an apologist for the developments that were going on. Now, there is a question as to whether this ideological costume can be refurbished in some form after the crisis, or how easily it can be refurbished, or how much it will have to be refurbished. And I can tell you that this is a subject, from my lifetime experience in the economics profession, that economists actually think about a lot. In fact, they think about this more, I would say, than they do about the economy itself. What's really interesting to economists is what's going to fly in terms of public acceptance, which then turns into a kind of academic success. It's hard for me to believe that a version of Marxism is going to take over as the dominant ideology of neoliberal capitalism from neoclassical economics, although, curiously enough, this might not be so crazy. In fact, the version of it that would probably take over would be Ricardian, would be a Ricardian version, not a specifically revolutionary Marxist version. But I think something more like the economics of Smith and Ricardo might be in the cards, an economics that says class divisions are the way the society has to be organized. And the real question of economic policy and economic organization is how do you manage a class-divided society and its relationship. Keynes, well, you know, as ideology, Keynesianism had a kind of run. Perry may discuss this more because he has this wonderful book about the money interest and the public interest that discusses this issue. Keynesianism had a kind of run as the dominant ideology. And one of the interesting things to me, since I was brought up through that period, is how come it didn't work better? Why was it so unstable? As far as I can tell, the mainstream Keynesianism of the 1950s and the 1960s really did not collapse because of internal intellectual inconsistencies or a failure to deal with the stagflation crisis of the 1970s. It basically collapsed because it was unstable ideologically in the dynamics of American scholarly and academic debate. Now, the question then is, again, what could take the place of that? Perhaps it would be a neoclassicism which had been leavened very, very substantially with ideas like externalities and social coordination issues. That's certainly one idea. Or a neoclassicism which shifts from rationality as an apology for the institutions of capitalism to behaviorism as an apology for the failure of the institutions of capitalism. I mean, you know, this is like the English teacher in a book, The Way It's Supposed to Be, who came into the teacher's lounge and said, "I'm a good English teacher. The problem is these students aren't good students." So you could have an economics that said, "We have an excellent system. We just don't have the right people to operate it." But we can maybe talk about all those things during the discussion.
Okay, I just wrote a book recently called The Enigma of Capital. It's now published in Britain. It'll be out later, and it attempts to reconstruct a version of Marxian theory to address the conundrums of the times. I can't obviously talk about the whole thing in 20 minutes, so I'll just talk about a couple of aspects of it which are, I think, relevant. In the Grundrisse, Marx actually lays out a central idea about capital, in which he says capital cannot abide limits. Whenever it encounters limits, it converts those limits into barriers that can be transcended or bypassed. So one of the interesting questions which you would then look at is, well, where are the limits? And how does capital deal with those limits? And in what senses can we then use that theoretical apparatus to enlighten us? For me, I think capital is understood as a process. It's not a thing. It's a process of circulation in which money is cast into circulation in order to make more money. Now, there are various ways in which you can do that, but the manner in which Marx looked at it was to look very closely at production capital, which has a circulation process in which money is used to go out into the marketplace, buy labor power and means of production, and then choosing a technology and organizational form, bring those together in a labor process. And that labor process produces a commodity, which is then sold in the market for the original money plus the extra money, which Marx liked to talk of as surplus value, that we can talk of as profit. The interesting thing that then happens is that part of that profit, for reasons which are very interesting, has to get recapitalized as fresh capital. So this circulation process is the basic circulation process that occurs within the body politic of capitalism, and is an expansionary process. Therefore, what this means is that when you read Angus Madison and people like that, that capitalism has actually expanded at a compound rate of growth since 1750 or so, on average at 2.25% per year. And actually, if you look at how the business press and everybody else talks about things, 3% compound growth is considered okay. Less than that, things are getting sluggish. 0 is a crisis. So lack of growth is a crisis. So this means that we're committed to 3% compound growth, no matter what. Now, in 1970, 3% compound growth, given the size of the global economy, meant you had to find new investment opportunities for about $0.4 trillion. Given the size of the economy today, and I'm using constant dollars, you'd have to find new investment opportunities for about $1.6 trillion. By 2030, you'll have to find new investment opportunities for $3 trillion. Part of the argument I would make is that the compound rate of growth is getting harder and harder to sustain, and I think part of the crisis which has been brewing throughout the neoliberal period has been lack of real possibilities of finding profitable investment opportunities for more and more capital. If you turn to the World Bank and the IMF reports again and again and again, they'll say the world is awash with surplus liquidity. And right now, people are saying there's surplus liquidity. Where can you put your money in such a way that you're going to make a profit? Where is it going to happen? And I think we are at an inflection point where the compounding rate of growth cannot be sustained for a variety of reasons. And it is therefore encountering barriers. Now, when Marx talks about limits and barriers, if you go back to that process that I mentioned, that process of circulation, the barriers can be easily checked off. And they're partly technical barriers and they're partly social barriers. The first barrier is, where does the initial capital come from? How is it assembled? How is it brought together in the right quantities, in the right places, and the right times to be able to actually get in motion to earn the profit? Now, Marx treated this actually as a problem of primitive accumulation in capital and said, well, it's primitive accumulation, you get... He didn't really take it very seriously. But I think it has to be taken seriously because actually that bringing together of capital means actually finding all kinds of small savings and bringing them together. And I'm very surprised in a way that Marx didn't pay more close attention to the theories of Saint-Simon, who kind of said that actually the association of capitals is how you set up the railroads, it's how you set up all of the big business ventures, and that therefore the association of capitals is a fundamental aspect of what capitalist history is about. This became particularly clear to me when I was working on Second Empire Paris and the exit from the crisis of 1848. And part of the exit was, of course, by rebuilding Paris. This is how you employed the surplus capital. It was, put into the building. But in order to do that, you needed new financial institutions. And the Pereire brothers set up credit institutions. The state actually set up new kinds of financing, which were a bit shady, as they nearly always end up being. But that was, in fact, a revolution in financial organization which occurred in the 1850s, which allowed Paris to be rebuilt in the way it was. So the question is, what is the financial structure which allows this process to work? And how does it work geographically? How do you take surplus capital in one part of the world and put it to another? And in fact, the whole history of capitalism is about the history of financial innovations. Again and again and again. Each time there is a crisis, you come out of it with a new set of financial institutions. It was very interesting to note that about a third of the people employed in the great slump of unemployed in the great slump of the 1930s were unemployed because of failures in the construction industry. So what was the institutional response? That was when things like Fannie Mae were set up. That's when the mortgage institutions were revamped. And it was, of course, on that basis that a lot of the surplus capital that was around after World War II went into the suburbanization of the United States. The surplus capital was actually amassed, and it was then through those institutional arrangements, Robert Moses and all that kind of stuff, and the GI Bill and all those sorts of things, institutional arrangements which really brought together the capital and allowed it to be used in a certain kind of way. What this means, two things, is that if those institutional arrangements are defective in some way or go out of whack in some way, you can get a crisis because they don't function effectively in relationship to the circulation process. The other problem is that the people who control the finance capital are going to take interest. They're going to take their cut. And they can take too much. They can get too powerful. So there's a power relation which emerges between finance capitalists and industrial capitalists. The British economy has been screwed for a very long time because the British have actually supported the City of London vis-à-vis the industrial structure of Britain. And in fact, the industrial structure of Britain has suffered immensely because the policies were oriented to support the City of London, the finance capitalists not to support the production apparatus. So there's the first technical and social barrier which can arise. The second arises in labour markets, more obvious. If labour is too strong, it's too well organised. At the scarcities of labour, then wages go up, and then there's all kinds of pressures on capital. So the labour market is a big issue. And in the 1950s and 1960s, the labour market was geographically segmented. It always is geographically segmented, so you're always talking about local labour markets, but it was very much segmented in terms of national economies at the time. And in the 1960s in particular, labour was extremely strong. Very strong. It was very strong in the United States, very strong in Europe. And in many respects, it was a barrier. And it was a class barrier, and the capitalists knew it, and they set out to crush labour, which they did, of course, during the 1970s and 1980s. By the time you get to 1985, labour is no longer a barrier. You've dealt with it by offshoring and immigration, and you've dealt with it by technological change, you've dealt with it politically, you've dealt with it in all sorts of ways, Pinochet, the Argentinian generals, Reagan, Thatcher, all the rest of it. You smash labour. And that then solves the labour problem. So you don't have the labour problem, but in the 1960s you did have a labour problem. So that's the second barrier. The third barrier is where are the means of production. Now there are some technical issues here I'm going to bypass, which can actually produce crises as well. But the crisis that lies behind it is the relation to nature. Are there limits in nature? Now there's a long history of limits in nature being actually spelled as actually the barrier to capital accumulation. Capitalism has been very sophisticated about dealing with that. The Malthusian story has been around for a couple of hundred years, and it's never really stuck. But you do get into moments where there have to be major adjustments in order to deal with barriers, limits in nature. And this is a wonderful example, if you look historically, of how what seem like limits get turned into barriers that then get transcended or circumvented. And we see some attempt to do that now by kind of saying, okay, we can do these new things. Although some of the things they're doing are absolutely daft. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting is back in the 18th century, the big barrier to continued capital accumulation was the fact that the land had to be used both for energy production and for food production, and you couldn't do both. Capitalism would not have gone its way until the British figured out if you can go underground and use the resources of the Carboniferous and the Cretaceous, then you're okay. That's why all this stuff about, biofuels is nuts, absolute nuts, because you're going back into that trap that the British escaped back in the 17th century. But the relation to nature is a big issue. And there are many people who now argue that we're at, the sustainability argument, all of those sorts of things. And this is a real serious question. And so here is a potential barrier that has to be dealt with, a limit that has to be dealt with, and how it's dealt with and the rest of it is significant. Then there is the whole kind of question of technology and organizational form. Now, technology and organizational form is like hardware and software. And the technology is machines and then the organizational form. There's been a lot of kind of, we're talking about productivity here, and the productivity organization and the way in which labor and means of production get. Now, technological change is absolutely vital to the continuation of capitalism. And again, capitalism has been very sophisticated at the way in which it actually promotes technological change, organizes technological change and organizational change. It occurs as a tremendous kind of imperatives for all sorts of reasons. But you can see immediately that to the degree that technological change actually involves you in investments in fixed capital and fixed infrastructures and all the rest of it, this can actually become excessive technological change, can create all kinds of barriers, all kinds of difficulties. If you have to throw out your computer every 5 minutes instead of every 4 years as you do now, you're in real difficulties. And we can see that, planned obsolescence, all those kinds of issues get crushed in here. So the technological organizational form can become destabilizing. On the other hand, stagnation in technological and organizational forms can actually then create the big barrier. Capital has at various times stagnated technologically and organizationally, and I would argue again the 1960s it sometimes stagnated, in part because its organizational form at that time was very much more monopolistic. I've mentioned the world was organized according to national economies. The auto companies in this country were pretty much an oligopoly at the time. There was no outside competition coming in. And as Barnard and Sweezy talked about in the theory of monopoly capital, the auto companies didn't have to engage in rapid technological change. There was not the pressure on them. They could concede wage increases and then just pass them on in terms of inflation. So if you look at back in the 1960s, one of the big problems was, if you like, the oligopoly and the monopoly kind of structure. That got broken in the 1970s, 1980s by, bringing in the Japanese and the German and the international and the global car and all those things, which was actually allowed by decreasing transport costs and reducing barriers to trade and all the rest of it that went on in the 1970s, 1980s. So suddenly the world moved from a sort of a comfortable kind of monopoly kind of structure in which the French Communist Party could talk about state monopoly capitalism, Barnard and Sweezy could talk about monopoly capitalism here, We went from that situation to a highly competitive kind of economy. Now, one of the consequences of the attack upon the working classes during the 1970s and 1980s was that actually wages have stagnated. There has, in fact, been wage repression. You have, in effect, a low-wage economy. And all the data from all the OECD countries, and actually even data from China, now show that the wage bill is a smaller proportion of gross domestic product now than it's been for a very, very long time. So less and less money is going into wages. You've got wage repression, wages are low. But at the same time, excessive competition is putting you in a situation where profits are low. So you end up with a very low, profit margins low, and wages low. It's a very peculiar kind of economy that starts to emerge in the 1980s, 1990s, along those lines. So this is, if you like, partly also associated with this organizational form. Then there are barriers that occur in the labour process, and this, of course, is what the autonomistas talk about. This is what Tronti Negri and all those other people talk about. It's the worker councils, it's the trade, it's the shop stewards movement and the trade on the shop floor management, all those kinds of things. And there was a crisis of control of labour on the shop floor, no question about it. 1960s, early 1970s. And capital didn't know how to deal with it. It tried to deal with it by co-optation, quality circles, the Japanese did it by having calisthenics and all that sort of thing before you went to work, and all kinds of ways in which you tried to discipline labour and bring them into a new kind, all kinds of things like that sort. So the shop floor issue is a big one, and of course in that time you produce the autonomista argument that this is where the real revolution is going to occur. It's going to be on the factory floors. Again, by the time you get to the 1980s, I think that possibility had disappeared. You could take your labour to wherever labour was most docile, and the shop floor discipline could be enforced in all sorts of ways, particularly when you're in China and you've got the Communist Party and all those kinds of things. So I think that argument started to disappear, but it was important during the 1960s, early 1970s. This then leads into, okay, you produce the commodity. Now, the commodity is then sold. Now, the big question is, where does the extra, who do you sell it to? You're expanding the system. You need more money at the end of the day than you started out with. Where can you find it? Two barriers here. One is you've got to stimulate desire in a population in such a way that they actually feel crazy if they don't have the right kind of stuff and they're not changing stuff. So you stimulate fashion. This has been going on since the 1850s, again in Paris, and this is what the new department stores were about and new lifestyles were about. So it's part you've got to stimulate the desire, but then you've got to have the money to fulfill that desire. So where does the extra money come from? And Rosa Luxemburg raised this point way back and kind of said, there isn't a place where it can come from except from the outside. So she kind of said, well, that's what imperialism does for you. You get the money out of China. You sell your goods to India, and then the Indians kind of will sell opium to the Chinese, and the silver comes back from China and brings it into, back to London. So there's a sort of a surplus of money in monetary forms out there which have not yet been absorbed into the system. There's also a good deal of residual wealth in the ex-feudal institutions, the aristocratic houses, but that gradually is absorbed. There's still a bit of that left. I guess the Vatican will soon have to melt down all its gold to pay off all of those, people who are suing it, so that'll help. But basically what we're in right now, given the way the economy's worked, is the feudal residuals are gone. They've already been absorbed, and much of the rest of the world has now been absorbed into it. So we don't have, if you like, an effective demand there, which is really going to stabilize the system. And this is one of the conundrums of Marxian theory, which I suddenly realize is actually solved in Volume 1 of Capital with a neat little thing. The answer is that the extra demand which you need to mop up the expansion of the product is given by tomorrow's expansion. So tomorrow's expansion absorbs yesterday's exit. But in order for that to happen, there's a time gap. And into this time gap steps the credit system. So you need the credit system to come into this again. So actually the credit system operates at both ends of this kind of process. So that's the financial stuff. Now Marx didn't want to deal with this because credit and interest is a fact of distribution, not of production, and he wanted to leave the side questions of distribution. I think he was very wrong in doing that. And I think Marxists who followed him on that have been very wrong. So we've got to put that in there front. But there's an interesting sense in which, therefore, the credit system is a central nervous system in this whole thing. This is most easily set up when you look at the housing market. I mean, financiers lend to developers who then build houses. And the same financiers lend to people to buy the houses. So, in fact, they're manipulating both the supply and demand of housing simply by extending credit. And that, of course, is one of the things that's been going on in this country, and it partly underpins the crisis in the housing market, which we've been through. So the credit institutions then also become significant. Now, each one of these barriers is potentially a danger for the capitalist system, because the simple flow of capital and the continued expansion has to go on and on and on. And when it sticks at any of those moments, you get then a crisis. And if you look very clearly at the thing, in the 1960s and 1970s, you can identify the points there were. It was the labor market, it was the labor process, it was the monopoly control, and to some degree, people would then argue also there was a problem with nature, because that's when the limits to growth stuff started coming out. Now we've got a different story. The big problem is effective demand, the big problem. And a lot of that is leading to shifts. And those shifts are, what in effect capital does is it never resolves its crisis tendencies, it simply moves them around. It moves it from one thing to another. We've been through a crisis of financial institutions. Actually, we're now in a crisis of sovereign debt of states. And actually, that crisis seems to me a very difficult one, and it ain't going to go away. And to some degree, you can see how it shifted from one thing to the other, and what that has really been about. So what this suggests then is that capital accumulation has been running into certain difficulties. With a low wage, low profit margin economy, what many capitalists started to do, what many moneyed people started to do, was not put their money into production, but to start to buy up assets. So we start to get speculation on asset values. And asset markets are Ponzi-like. People buy into them, the prices go up, and so people say, oh, that looks good, put more money in, prices go up. They have a Ponzi character. And we've been through asset bubble after asset bubble after asset bubble. And the strange thing is everybody thinks this crisis is new. But you look back and see what happened in East and Southeast Asia in 1997-98, what happened to Argentina in 2001. We've forgotten already that the savings and loan crisis that occurred in this country. We've forgotten about 1973 and the property market crash and all those kinds of things. This last 30 years have been crash after crash after crash after crash. And it's been like that all along. And this one is, in effect, part of that kind of process. So I have 1 minute to kind of say, when we understand that, one of the things that immediately comes out is that you have to start to think seriously about an anti-capitalist transition. And if you're not prepared to think about an anti-capitalist transition, you're simply going to go back into crash after crash after crash, in which you're going to get fictitious values created, they're going to fall apart. That is where we're going to be headed. And furthermore, if you look at the class character of this, which I haven't had time to get into, the class character of this has been about greater and greater concentration of economic power in a smaller and smaller elite. And if you say, can they preserve themselves, the answer is, hell yes, they can, unless they're stopped. And that means class struggle. Sorry, but that's where we're at. Thanks.
The alphabet has come around to me. So I guess, yes, I have been having a good crisis. But I want to take you back. The title of this talk, the title of this panel, took me back to 23 years ago when I first came to Barnard College in the fall of 1987. And I taught for a while a course that is still taught called Theoretical Foundations of Political Economy, which I taught as a Smith, Marx, Keynes course. So you can see why that sparked in my mind. Where the students read the great works in the original, The Wealth of Nations, Capital Volume 1. And in my version of it, they read Keynes also, the general theory of employment, interest, and money. And I taught the students, and I guess I still think this, that these three great works could be viewed as attempts by each of these authors to decipher a new stage in the development of the market economy that had just come to a kind of level of fruition at their time. Smith being writing really about the commercial revolution, the integration of local markets with long-distance markets. Smith writing about the Industrial Revolution, the logic of self-expanding capital, which we've heard about. And Keynes being about the managerial revolution, the nation-state counterpart of the rise of the large corporation. I tell students that the lasting value of living with these texts and studying them again and again is that the modern economy is all three of these things, okay? That it is helpful to be able to put on these hats and look at each problem through these lenses, because the modern economy is really a palimpsest of all three of these revolutions. And so my answer to the title of the panel is not either or, but Marx and Keynes, and maybe something else as well. The global financial crisis has brought to everyone's attention the extent to which our economy has been financialized. Sanjay used that word in the introduction. And what do we mean by that? We mean the expansion of credit relations, most simply measured by the quite incredible increase in the ratio of debt to GDP, non-financial debt, but also financial debt, and the increasing size of financial intermediaries in our economy, the increasing amount of profit that flows to financial intermediaries in our economy. The crisis has also brought to our attention the extent to which, and I think this is not maybe as well appreciated in our focus on Goldman Sachs and so forth, the extent to which household mortgage debt has become so important quantitatively in the economy. More important than government debt. You hear people whining about government debt, much more household debt than there is government debt or business debt. In 2006, just to give you a figure here, on the eve of the crisis, the household share of total non-financial debt in the United States was 44.3%. 44.3% of outstanding primary debt was owed by households, mostly mortgage debt. This is a historic peak. Compared to 32.1% business debt and 23.6% government debt. So these are this phenomenon of financialization. All this mortgage debt, by the way, on top of it's quite true about wage stagnation. Okay, so there's this incredible debt being piled on top of these income flows that are stagnating. So these are the central phenomena of our time. This financialization that I think we need to understand. And Smith, Marx, and Keynes are helpful, but they don't really grapple with that piece very much, as we just heard. Volume 2, Marx has very good taste always, and so he follows Tuke. But even Tuke is talking about a much simpler financial world than our modern world. So I am, I guess, an intellectual historian, and I'm telling a little autobiographical piece. So I'll continue. I started in fall of 1987. 10 years later, I last taught theoretical foundations in the fall of 1996, which, no coincidence, was also the semester when I first taught economics of money and banking. A course I've continued to teach up to the present, eventually coupled with a second course, which I just was teaching just before this panel, Topics in Money and Finance, which I teach as a kind of theoretical foundations course focused on money and finance. Students read the great works in the original, beginning this year with Walter Bagehot, Lombard Street. The great thing about undergraduates at this institution is if you say, we're going to read Bagehot, they just read Bagehot. They don't know that nobody reads Bagehot. I'm sure I have students here, and I'm letting the cat out of the bag. And we also read the very same week the famous 1923 10th Annual Report of the Federal Reserve Board, when Benjamin Strong was trying to wrap his arms around what to do with this new Federal Reserve that had been created in 1913. This week we're reading Irving Fisher, Capital and Income, and Harry Markowitz, Portfolio Selection. And the final week we'll read Fisher-Black, Pricing of Options and Corporate Liabilities. So I tell you all of this to let you know that the last 10, 15 years of my intellectual life, I've been looking for the ellipsis in our question mark. People say, and I think it's a good place to start, that we're living today through a Minsky moment. This reference is to Hyman Minsky and his famous financial instability hypothesis. And so we need Minsky as well, or more accurately, I would say, the intellectual tradition to which Minsky belongs, because Minsky is not alone. He's not one of these system builders in the way that Smith, Marx, and Keynes sort of were, or even Keynes wasn't so much. But there's a tradition that he's drawing on, and it's that tradition that I have attempted to resurrect in my new book and to rehabilitate for the modern world. The new book is, Sanjay kindly gave you the title, The New Lombard Street, but he didn't give you the subtitle, which is the key, How the Fed Became the Dealer of Last Resort. So this is a reference to Bagehot and Bagehot's Bagehot's emphasis that we need a central bank as a lender of last resort. So it's updating 100 years later, 150 years later. So this tradition that I'm trying to resurrect, I call the money view. I'm going to tell you some basic principles of the money view. And I contrast that with the economics view and the finance view. It has fallen into disuse. It's not been available for us to use in this crisis very much, except for dissidents like Hyman Minsky. It's fallen into disuse in academic circles, but it has lived very adequately in the world of for-profit speculators and the world of central bankers, because they need it. Okay, they live in the world of the plumbing of our modern financial institution, and so they can't afford to abstract from it as basically economics and finance do in order to focus on other problems. So I say Marx and Keynes and Bagehot. Here's Bagehot in 1873. He says, "I am by no means an alarmist. I believe that our system, though curious and peculiar, may be worked safely. But if we wish so to work it, we must study it. Money will not manage itself, and Lombard Street has a great deal of money to manage." This is the ethos of the central banker, and it is not neoliberalism. Okay, it's the idea that the credit system, there's something inherently unstable there, and it needs to be paid attention to. Here's Minsky, 1967, about 100 years later. He says, "Capitalism is essentially a financial system, and the peculiar behavioral attributes of a capitalist economy center around the impact of finance on system behavior." But even Minsky doesn't help us. There's been a lot of resurrection of Minsky moment, but Minsky is worried about business credit, and he's thinking about fixed capital investment and so forth. We may get an actual Minsky moment. The commercial mortgage crisis is just looming right now, but the first bit of this has been a residential mortgage crisis, and a crisis of the plumbing of the monetary system, which is not something that Minsky was particularly focused on. The plumbing was just being put back together after a depression in World War II. So the central idea of the money view that I want to emphasize, and it's something that Minsky in early work called the survival constraint or the reserve constraint, or maybe you want to call it the liquidity constraint, that every unit in society, every unit, meaning you, me, businesses, Goldman Sachs, the United States, faces a pattern of cash commitments and a pattern of cash flows today and stretching on into the future. And if today cash inflows are insufficient to meet cash commitments, there's only three things you can do. You can either dishoard, meaning drawing down your money balances, but you run out of those money balances. You can borrow, which really just means shifting the survival constraint into the future, when hopefully it'll be easier to deal with. That's the goal. Or you can liquidate, which means selling assets for whatever the market will give you for them. That's a financial crisis when you get to stage 3. So the focus of the money view is really on the second of these, and on the rate, that is to say, borrowing, and on the rate of interest that is charged to put off the day of reckoning, as I would say, in this way. From the perspective of the money view, the money rate of interest, the overnight rate of interest, is a sensitive barometer indicating the degree to which the pattern of cash commitments is matching up with the pattern of cash flows in the economy as a whole. So it's a barometer, but even more it operates when the system, to the extent that the system is self-regulating, which is limited. To the extent that it's self-regulating because of that, okay, that this short-term rate of interest operates as a coordinating signal, telling people that to hurry up and pay their bills. Higher cost of delaying the day of reckoning means that those who can pay more quickly will, so allowing scarce lending resources to flow to those who most need them. So, and this basically, the money view views this constraint, day-by-day liquidity constraint, as the central disciplining feature, the central coordinating feature of market economies. And it's not much. You know, it's a bit of a weak read. So we have all these economic theories about intertemporal budget constraints and transversality conditions on into the infinite horizon. You know, some notion that people are forming plans and coordinating their plans out into the distant future, and those are views that the economy might be in equilibrium. Okay, but when you take away into these fictions, I mean, these are wealth constraints. The only thing that constrains behavior is wealth, and you can sort of allocate it any way you want over time. The liquidity constraint says it really matters at what time your cash inflows are coming in, and at what time the cash commitments are coming due. And you can form, views about what the future should look like and act on those, but there's no particular reason for them to be consistent with one another. And so we have the inherent instability of credit. This is Bagehot. This is Hawtrey, the great British central banking tradition. This is Keynes. There's a side of Keynes. This is Minsky. This is the tradition that I am interested in resurrecting. Marx and Keynes and Bagehot. Now, long ago, Bagehot taught us to view financial crisis as a time when the survival constraint binds. He didn't use those words. And it threatens a collapse of the web of credit as non-payment here leads to non-payment elsewhere. And he urged the use of the central bank. That's what the book is all about. He urged the use of the central bank's balance sheet as lender of last resort, to lend freely at a high rate, a high interest rate. The high interest rate is to provide an incentive for the private money market to recover and at a better rate after the crisis. This is the origin of all modern thinking about monetary economics, Bagehot, about the role of the central bank. And once the central bank takes on this responsibility, as it did after 1873, more and more self-consciously, it then begins to think about, well, how can we avoid getting there in the first place? We don't want to just mop up, okay? So this is the origin of monetary policy, the origin of financial regulation, the notion that we can prevent this from happening. And that's this mantra, lend freely at a high rate, is on the forehead of all central bankers. And this is what they came into the crisis with. And this is what they tried to do to start. And it didn't really work, okay? And the last 2 years has been a process of innovation and trying new things and more drastic measures. And so that's what my book is about, a dealer of last resort. But I want here not to trump on the message of the book, but to return to the point about financialization. How does the money view help us think about financialization? I was saying that Marx, Keynes don't help us that much. From a money perspective, the important thing about financialization is that it has vastly increased the quantity of cash commitments, okay, the chances that the number of survival constraints that can be binding is much increased. Okay, the fragility of the system from that point of view, but also in some sense this is an attempt to make it more self-regulating. You know, that if this is the only thing that actually regulates the economy, the survival constraint, now it's in a lot more places in our economy than it used to be. Yeah, I'm fine. I'm going to be before 10. The survival constraint is a much more important phenomenon in, didn't you say 5 minutes? Yeah, okay. I thought that was like, it's not the 0 hour, it's the 5 minute hour. The survival constraint is a much more important phenomenon in modern economic relations. This is my main point. The survival constraint is a much more important today because of financialization than it was really ever in the past. And yet, this survival constraint is exactly what has been abstracted from in modern finance and in modern economics. So resurrection of the money view, it seems to me, is key for understanding how this financialization thing is working. That's the first point. The second point is that Bagehot explained for the 19th century British economy the consequence of the inherent instability of credit meant that there had to be an enlarged role of the central bank. That money would not manage itself. Okay, you can say that and be the editor of The Economist, and it was in fact quite controversial when he did say it in 1873, but it became a bestseller. So one thought, because we've moved from a banking credit system to a capital market credit system, is that the role of the modern central bank needs to be reconceptualized, not as lender of last resort to the banking system, but as dealer of last resort to the larger financial system. And that in doing so, we also need to reconceptualize what monetary policy is about, what financial regulation policy is about, because all of that builds from those starting points. And we also have to bring all of that up back into light and back into economics, where it was before modern economics and modern finance rose. Financialization is a fact, I think perhaps the central fact of our moment, and it's tempting in times of crisis to hope that it's a fact that can be reversed. We don't have to understand it, we can just condemn it. I take Bagehot's attitude, for better or worse. I believe that our system, though curious and peculiar, may be worked safely, but if we wish so to work it, we must study it. Above all, that means rehabilitation of the money view, Marx, Keynes, and Bagehot, and others as well. And so in closing, I'll just mention another name, because Duncan mentioned my first book on the American institutionalists. A few minutes ago, I quoted figures that were taken from the flow of funds statistics, an accounting system that was invented by a famous American institutionalist, Morse Copeland, in 1951. I actually assigned my intro students to read some chapters of that book. A little challenging for them. My point is this. There are, in the history of economics, tremendous stores of genetic diversity just waiting to be mobilized by the right catastrophe. This is one of those moments.
Sorry to be taxing you so late, but I can't help my surname. When I was in Columbia about a year ago, Joseph Stiglitz asked me, "You sound like a Keynesian, why do you call yourself a Marxist?" So I'd like to begin by first saying a few things about the relationship as I see it between Marx and Keynes, and then subsequently I'd like to say a little bit about the crisis, which to my mind is not synonymous with the financial crisis that has happened over the last year and a half. As I see it, Marxism is not a closed system in which you just have a set of bodies. On the contrary, I see Marxism as essentially open-ended, which enriches itself, indeed I would say reconstructs itself by taking into its corpus scientific work done in other traditions, including the non-Marxist tradition. Now, in that sense, therefore, incorporation of Keynes's basic economic ideas into Marxism is not a problem at all. And especially not a problem because many of these ideas, the fundamental ideas of the principle of effective demand, already appear in Marx himself, not to mention Rosa Luxemburg or Mikhail Kalitsky, who came to the Keynesian ideas before Keynes. So the real difference lies not with regard to the economics. The real difference lies with regard to the perspective. You see, Keynes basically saw capitalism as a malleable system, a system in which irrational outcomes could be avoided through the application of correct ideas. Irrational outcome is something which he saw as a state of affairs from which every section of society can be made better off if you move out of that state of affairs. In other words, society may periodically get trapped into a state of affairs from which a movement would actually benefit everybody, but nonetheless it gets trapped, and that's the irrationality of the outcome. But you can find your way out of these irrational outcomes if you have correct ideas. Of course, the Depression was the classic example of an irrational outcome. If you got out of the Depression, workers would benefit, capitalists would benefit, everybody would benefit. But the fact that you had to get out of the Depression required a correct idea, such as Keynes' own. But of course, the analogy of the Depression is something which really carried forward even to the world of social conflicts. A social conflict really is an irrational outcome. If you get out of the social conflict, almost every section of society would be better off than they were when they were in the social conflict. And therefore, that, according to Keynes, made it possible to have preemptive negotiations such that you don't get into social conflicts. And that's what gave capitalism the kind of malleability, that it was a system in which you could actually have preemptive negotiations such that you have, through correct application of theory, neither conflicts nor crises. Now, as opposed to this, I think Marx basically saw capitalism as a spontaneous system, a self-driven system. It's not a malleable system, it's a self-driven system which is subject to certain tendencies of its own, and what is more, ideas are always linked to class interests. The dominant ideas happen to be those which are espoused by the dominant classes, and consequently, it was inevitable that the system would always be caught in crises and conflicts. Now, of course, the fact that it's a spontaneous system did not mean that intervention was not possible. But if you have intervention which comes in the way of spontaneity, then of course it makes the system dysfunctional, because of which either interventions have to be deepened and carried forward until the system itself got transcended, or interventions had to be eschewed and you were back to square one. So, in a certain sense, the fundamental difference between Marx and Keynes lies not with regard to the economics or principles of effective demand or such like, but it really lies with regard to three things. Firstly, the transformative role of ideas per se, which are independent of any kind of struggle. Secondly, it has to do with the malleability of the system. And thirdly, it has to do with the capacity of the system to avoid conflicts and crises. On this, Marx and Keynes fundamentally differed. Putting it differently, really the difference relates to political praxis, that if you believe that the system is malleable and through correct ideas you can actually preempt crises and conflicts, in that case, basically you reason with authority. You reason with those who are in power. You reason with governments. You became a civil servant giving good advice based on sound theory. But on the other hand, if you actually believed that the system was not capable of avoiding conflicts and crises, then of course the ideas which may be correct were, or the ideas that may carry society forward had to be backed up by social struggle. And therefore, instead of being a civil servant, you actually carried out political praxis that mobilized people for social change. Now, paradoxically, or ironically, I should say, the fact that ideas are not accepted only because of their intellectual merit is something which was demonstrated in Keynes's own lifetime. Keynes's own ideas were not accepted in Britain in the period of the 1930s. In 1929, in fact, Keynes had suggested through Lloyd George a program of public works financed by fiscal deficit. Nobody accepted it. Even the New Deal here is something which, even though apparently put forward ideas of state intervention in promoting demand, fairly soon, as you know, Roosevelt withdrew and you had the 1937 crisis. The power of finance, which thwarted the acceptance of Keynesian ideas in Britain, which in fact thwarted the prospects of the New Deal getting the United States out of the crisis in the 1930s itself, so that the world had to wait for the Second World War in order to come out of the Great Depression. That power of finance is something which would suggest that it is not the power of ideas, but the power of material interest that really determine which ideas are accepted, which ideas become powerful, which ideas do not. And this was something which actually affected Keynes's own thinking. In the post-Second World War period, in my view, there was a changed correlation of class forces. You had a situation where the working class was in the ascendancy. It had actually come out through the Second World War, suffered greatly, power of finance was on the decline, and of course there was a threat of socialism. Under these conditions, state intervention in demand management, workers were now to go back to the pre-war situation, state intervention in demand management, and of course the application of Keynesian ideas and welfare state measures is something which actually did become more acceptable, basically not because these ideas weren't there before, but because of the changed correlation of class forces in the post-Second World War period. But on the other hand, in fact, through this period itself, the rejection of Keynesian ideas, the demise of Keynesian ideas, because the reascendancy of finance in the form of international finance capital, which is based on a process of globalization of finance, moving from one country to another, and therefore undermining the capacity of the nation state to carry out Keynesian intervention, or, the Keynesian type state intervention in demand management, because the state we are talking about is a nation state, is something which really once more brought the world to a situation where not only Keynesianism, but even dirigism of the third world variety, planning and so on, which existed in lots of third world countries post-decolonization, is something which actually got over. And we had the re-emergence of a world in which neoliberal capitalism ruled under the hegemony of international finance capital. Now, I think there are certain specific spontaneous tendencies in this era of neoliberal capitalism, which are far more significant and which often escape discussion under the impact of the current financial crisis. Let me list some of them. The first thing is a resumption of the destruction of peasant and petty production, which has always been a feature of capitalism. Let's just ask ourselves a very simple question. If you have capital accumulation, then of course the process of capital accumulation requires demand. It sets up demand for all kinds of exhaustible resources. It sets up demand for primary commodities, which are either exhaustible resources or products of inputs like land, which are in limited supply. On the basis of this, David Ricardo had argued that over a period of time, capital accumulation would come to a stop, that the terms of trade would move in favor of primary commodities because they are more difficult to produce, they are more difficult to get hold of, they are exhaustible, they are based on limited availability of land and such like. But throughout the history of capitalism, leave aside war periods, the terms of trade have systematically moved against the primary commodities. One of the most remarkable puzzles in economics is that any economic theory would tell you that actually terms of trade should actually move in favor of primary commodities, but history shows the opposite. Why is that the case? Fundamentally, it's the case because of the fact that problems of excess demand as far as primary commodities are concerned have basically been resolved by capitalism by squeezing absorption in pre-capitalist sectors and thereby releasing primary commodities, including food, for use within the capitalist sector. And this has always meant an attack on petty production, on peasant production, which for a while was stopped in the dirigist period after the Second World War in a number of third world countries, when the states actually promoted peasant production. But now, once more, you have a vastly, expanded, on an enormous scale, a resumption of that kind of an attack. And that kind of attack actually leads to absolute impoverishment of substantial segments of the world's population. The second feature, which is of course quite interesting, is the fact that now you have a situation where neoliberal capitalism, with all its freedom for finance as well as commodities to move across national borders, implies that the world economy is no longer segmented. In which case, you have a situation where the wages in the advanced capitalist countries can no longer be insulated from the deleterious impact of the third world labor reserves. In other words, if labor reserves try to push wages towards subsistence, then of course you cannot enjoy in one part of the world vastly higher wages than the subsistence level if commodities are freely mobile across borders. If it is the case that there is no fragmentation of the world or, separation of the world into different segments. As a result, you find that there's a tendency for the wage rates in the advanced capitalist countries to come down, and there's a tendency for the labor productivity in the underdeveloped countries like India and China to come up. Basically, which means that out of any given level of world output, there's a tendency for the surplus to increase. And this is further compounded to the extent that there's technological progress, because then the wages don't rise because the third world labor reserves are there to keep wages down. On the other hand, there is an increase in labor productivity compared to even what current frontier technologies are. As a result, you have a tendency for surplus to increase at the world level everywhere. And of course, this is something which we have seen in terms of vastly increased inequalities within countries and across countries, taking the world as a whole in the neoliberal period. But the implication of this also is that the problem of aggregate demand becomes far more difficult, because after all, if the surplus rises, as Barnard and Sweezy had argued long ago, then it becomes important that there be growing aggregate demand so that this surplus is actually realized. Now, the point is that this is a fundamental structural problem. There may be periods in which this gets camouflaged by asset bubbles or housing bubbles and so on. And there may be periods in which the collapse of the bubbles, in fact, adds to this basic structural crisis. There are periods, in other words, it alleviates the structural crisis. There are periods it might be adding to the structural crisis. But leaving aside even the bubbles or the financial crisis, there is an underlying structural crisis which arises from the fact that, taking the world as a whole, we have, for all the reasons, both because of the mobility of commodities across countries freely, as well as technological progress in a world in which the third world labor reserves keep down wages everywhere, there is a basic problem of aggregate demand that is increasingly arising. Therefore, there's a kind of, very basic structural crisis which is afflicting world capitalism, over and above the fact the vast numbers of peasants and petty producers are getting decimated in this era of neoliberal capitalism. Now, added to this are two or three other things. The firstly, to the extent that in low-wage countries like China or India, there is a rise in income inequalities, there is a rise in surplus because, as I said, productivity increases, then you find that they face a problem. They alone face a problem. Let's look at them alone. They face a problem of aggregate demand. But on the other hand, being low-wage countries, they can resolve this problem by, in fact, enlarging their export surplus. because after all, they are the low-wage countries. And if they enlarge their export surplus, like China is doing, then ipso facto, you would find countries like the United States enlarging their current account deficit. So the enlargement of the current account deficit in the United States is nothing else but a reflection of the fact that the share of surplus in China is actually increasing dramatically. And to the extent that happens, this is going to be another part of the structural problem of capitalism. To the extent that the US, in fact, wishes to enlarge the level of aggregate demand within the US or in the world as a whole, then of course you would find that the structure, this current account deficit, which would be increasing, would be an impediment to its actions. Add to it the usual objections of international finance capital to any active state intervention by the state that I was talking about earlier, then you find really a situation where there seems to be an impasse as far as capitalism is concerned. There is no state, not even the leading state, the United States, which is really capable of now jacking up with impunity the level of aggregate demand in the world economy. And if so, then you would find a continuous tendency for the persistence of high levels of unemployment, together with the fact that the real wages in the advanced countries would be coming down. At the same time, even in countries like India and China, which are these rapid growth economies, you would also find that because in these economies the surplus is rising, and of course there may not be a problem of aggregate demand because there's export surplus, but on the other hand, the income inequalities produce lifestyles, patterns of demand for goods, which really are highly non-employment intensive. Their capacity to generate employment is very little. As a result, their labor reserves also don't get used up. So you have a situation where unemployment rises in the advanced countries, unemployment doesn't go down in the rapidly growing countries, and therefore the world is going to be stuck with substantial labor reserves, with growing inequalities, with problems of aggregate demand, and of course with a situation where even the leading states would be incapable of intervening in the situation. And all this happening against a background of decimation of peasants and petty producers. Now this, therefore, to my mind, entails an impasse for capitalism. I think if we look at the crisis only in terms of the last couple of years' financial crisis, we would be missing the basic structural problems with which world capitalism currently is encumbered. Now, if that is the case, and there is no obvious way out of it, then, of course, the idea is that it's not a matter of quick fixes. It's not a question of some budgetary tricks. It's something which, in fact, would require a substantial restructuring. In particular, it would require an assault on the hegemony of international finance capital. And that assault is something which would actually require social struggles. It would actually require social conflicts. And consequently, the idea at this moment is not to reason to authority, but in fact to try and provide at least an understanding to carry forward this social struggle. The last point I'd like to make is that if we are talking on social struggle, then realistically, while we may wish the world as a whole to have a united struggle of workers or a united struggle of peasants, that's not realistic. And that being the case, the struggles would necessarily have to be located within individual nations and with the objective of altering the nature of those individual nation states and consequently a process of delinking from globalization, hopefully with the idea of relinking later into a more democratic process of globalization. Thank you.
I think you'll agree with me that that was a real intellectual feast by any standard at all. Let me just make one comment, which will also be the launching pad for a question, and then invite comments and questions from the audience before we turn back to the panel. And this is really on the possibility of compatibilism between compatibility between theoretical frameworks, which was a theme addressed by a number of the speakers. The development economist Ravi Kanbur wrote an influential essay a few years ago called The Nature of Disagreements, in which he tried to parse the different reasons that disagreements arise in development debates, and to understand to what extent those disagreements were because of differences in the understanding of facts, to what extent because of differences in values or in weights attached to different values, and to what extent because of differences in what Joseph Schumpeter called visions, pre-theoretic, pre-cognitive perspectives of some kind. It seems to me that this is a useful exercise. Are the disagreements that we face between theoretical perspectives of a kind which can ever be resolved, or which we should ever expect to be resolved? And here I would like to suggest we should have in mind two distinct models, since this is an activity in part of the Heyman Center for the Humanities. Let me mention one model which is a humanistic model, in which there are enduring disagreements which result from different conceptions, for example, of the good, as emphasized, for instance, by John Gray in some of his recent work, that there's no reason for us to expect moral or political, philosophical disagreements as to how society should be organized ever to end, because there are fundamental differences in understandings of the good, which we expect to endure. And for that reason, these conflicts will never be resolved fully. There's reasonable pluralism that can be that can be present with respect to conceptions of the good, ideas as to how to live one's life, or ideas as to how to organize society. This type of pluralism, reasonable pluralism, can also arise due to different perspectival viewpoints, which may not have to do with values as such, but with different understandings of the facts which result from perspective. For instance, the concept of positional objectivity, as outlined by Amartya Sen, is of this kind, that our understandings as to the temperature of the Atlantic Ocean at a moment of time will depend on where we measure that temperature. There is no such thing as the temperature of the Atlantic Ocean. One could understand that as a perspectival difference or as a problem of semantics, but many of our disagreements seem to turn on these kinds of differences in our descriptions of the facts at a minimum. Here again, we might expect that finding agreement might be challenging, perhaps not impossible, but challenging. Amartya Sen has argued that we might think of what he calls transpositional objectivity as being possible, some sort of synthetic perspective drawing on these different perspectives, which is in some sense closer to the truth, or closer to a fully warranted understanding. The entirely different model, which is more scientistic, an entirely different model, is that which suggests that some sort of final adjudication is possible between the different views which exist. My friend, the Italian economist Claudio Sardoni, for instance, has written a book called Marx and Keynes on Economic Recession, in which he tries to unpack in great detail the distinct views of Marx and Keynes in this respect, which of course matter for description, explanation, and prescription, even though there is also a substantial degree of overlap at the prescriptive level, one could argue, as Professor Patnaik has just argued. On this view, we should seek to come closer and closer to some understanding of what is fully warranted knowledge, and seek to, where possible, falsify certain views. Now, each of the important economic figures that we are concerned with gained precedence in part because of the resources which were offered by their theoretical perspective to address issues of concern to their contemporaries. For example, in Smith's case, The Wealth of Nations was very much, implicitly at least, a polemic against mercantilists. The title, The Wealth of Nations, is a reference to Smith's belief that one should adopt an expansive understanding of the goals of economic policy, encompassing what he called the subsistence, necessities, and conveniences of the people, which was a completely different point of view from that of the mercantilists who wanted merely to pile up treasure in the exchequer, without regard to how this was affecting the subsistence, conveniences, and necessities of the people. And of course, Smith also was very much concerned with arguing for the possibility of spontaneous order arising, which, as a result of decentralized activity, but in keeping with the demands of an impartial spectator. Marx was concerned with the ultimate generative role of labor and its consequent historical and economic causal role, as well as its moral and political claims. Keynes with the role of the state in overturning the inefficient and wasteful outcomes created by antisocial and self-centered decentralized activity occurring within the institutional structure of a capitalist economy. Even this brief synopsis suggests that these distinct perspectives to some degree address entirely different concerns. And so, echoing Perry Mehrling, should our slogan be not either or, but rather both and? And lest this seem like mere eclecticism, let me emphasize that we may, of course, have very strong moral and explanatory reasons to favor certain of these perspectives in certain tasks, and that might be, of course, a contextual determination. But in any event, theoretical pluralism would by itself seem to offer an important advance, or theoretical synthesis, if that's what we end up achieving, would seem by itself to offer an important advance over the monopoly of neoclassical and neoliberal theory. So I wonder, sanctified by scientism, I should add. And sometimes we might be lucky enough to have an overlapping consensus among certain views, and at other times we will have to choose, but at least we will know that we are doing so as partisans because of the values and the perspectives that we have. I wonder whether our commentators have any reflections on that point. But before I return to them, let me ask for comments and questions from the audience. I believe there are 2 microphones here, so perhaps you should come up and form a line. I suspect that's the most efficient mechanism. So there's 1 microphone on this side too, for those of you who wish to take advantage of it. Ahilan Kadirgama, please.
My question is to Professor Patnaik and Professor Harvey. As you know, Professor Patnaik, really enjoyed your narrative about the importance of international finance in relation to how it's broken these national borders. But historically, do you see this as tied to the rise of an American order or an American empire? And is it, do you see it at certain points in the interests of the nation states in the South to move in terms of delinking, or particularly the capitalist classes in the nation states in the South to move towards delinking, or is it in their interest to continue that linkage and in that process also prop up the American order? And to Professor Harvey, a question about among the barriers that you mentioned to capital, if the American order or the kind of international finance is a barrier, would that also be broken down into some form of multipolar world?
May I ask you to introduce yourself fully also, just affiliation.
Ahilan Kadirgama with the South Asia Solidarity Initiative.
Okay, so let's collect 2 or 3 questions. Yes.
Jonathan, I go to school at SIPA. And I was wondering if anybody could comment. We talked about the limits to capital accumulation. And I don't know if anybody's aware of Anwar Sheikh's paper that he's coming out at the Left Forum. He presented on the falling rate of profit, the data that shows that, and how it stabilized in the neoliberal era. But he also then showed the increasing rate of exploitation and the implication is that the falling rate of profit was stabilized by the increasing rate of exploitation. And I was wondering what you guys thought of that. Are there implications for that? Have we reached the limit on that, or does that exist?
Okay, 1 more, please.
Yeah, well, to test the compatibility of theoretical frameworks, I'm a physical systems scientist. I developed systems physics some years ago that lets me study in close detail uncontrolled systems, particularly ones in which the behaviors arise from the independent learning of their parts, like economies, and to distinguish between those that solve in their growth, solve ever more complex problems until they find problems they can't solve and collapse, and those that in the middle there switch to solving ever simpler problems. And nature's full of examples of both, and reach a point of stability and at a peak of health and resilience. And I asked my old friend Ken Boulding if he'd ever heard of such a thing, and he said, "Oh yeah, Keynes thought of an idea like that." And I checked, and indeed he had, and very much like mine. And he called his the widow's cruise, which has to do with at the point where earnings, when natural limits for whatever complex set of reasons are slowing down the growth process, and earnings are growing more slowly to prevent savings from continuing to grow ever more rapidly, that wouldn't it be more favorable if those with excess savings spent enough so that the system did not diverge in its internal relationships?
If you have a question, please do ask it.
I guess that's the question.
Okay, thank you.
Have you ever studied such a thing? Have you ever considered the need to stop our process of tackling ever more unsolvable problems?
Okay, thank you. So, well, there are only a couple more people here, so since perhaps it's easiest if we take both of your questions and then we'll return to the panel, please.
Okay. I don't see any problem with reconciling all these theories because Joan Robinson once pointed out that Keynes started where Koletsky began. A.K. Dasgupta said Keynes dynamized is Marx. So I don't see any conflict here. I do see some differences between you that boil down to this. You've all talked about financialization, and some of you, David Harvey particularly, but also Perry as well, have suggested that the problem of surplus capital appears as the symptom of financialization. Okay. Can we go with that? In this sense, the real problem in explaining crisis, the real problem that we face now is, in fact, surplus capital. Martin Wolf has estimated that 7.3% of GDP is now constituted by surplus profits, retained earnings that are not invested. The way I would translate that is that from 2000 till the present, capital's been on strike. Now consumption is declining as well, so aggregate demand has to be falling precipitously. This crisis will last forever so long as we can't enforce investment by capital or we can't raise consumption by wage laborers. We're all talking about the same thing, I think, but practically speaking, how would you address that?
Okay, thank you.
A capital strike, literally.
Thank you. Okay. Yes.
My name is Danny Luce, and I'm a Columbia alum. I was lucky to be taught Marxist economics by Professor Foley quite a long time ago. But a quick question for David Harvey.
Perhaps you could speak up a bit.
A short question for David Harvey and a question also for Professor Patnaik. For David Harvey, you mentioned very briefly the concept of fictitious capital. Could you elaborate a bit on how you see the role of the expansion of fictitious capital as part of the attempt by global capitalism to extricate itself from the current crisis? And for Professor Patnaik, you spoke of the assault on peasant production. What are the implications in the contemporary world of a massive dispossession of the global peasantry if, unlike in earlier periods of the history of capitalism, that dispossessed peasantry could be absorbed into the proletariat? But it seems quite clear that that is not on the cards now. So does this mean the growth of an ever more massive, permanently dispossessed and marginalized population?
Okay. Since there is one lone person here, we'll take yours as the final question.
I was wondering about prescriptions.
Please introduce yourself.
Asel Rustamova. And I was wondering about prescriptions. I was looking through listening to you from the perspective of governmentality of Michel Foucault, who argued about self-limiting state, that there is a certain kind of rationality that exists within the regulation, or that informs state government regulations, that is based on self-limiting state. So it seems like your prescription is to go back to a kind of a sovereign legal authority that will regulate the markets in a certain way. in a direct way rather than via incentives. So I was wondering what you can comment on that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. I think what we'll do is proceed in the same order as the speakers spoke initially. So Duncan, Foley, please.
Well, I'm struck by a certain...
3 minutes each, by the way.
3 minutes?
3 minutes.
I'm struck by a certain dialectic here that has to do with the idea that capitalism will solve some of its own problems. And I think we need to think about that functionality, this thesis of the functionality of capitalism very carefully. It's pretty clear to me that the fantasy of the night watchman state and all we need to do is get the rules right and the market will stabilize and take care of itself just doesn't correspond to any historical period of capitalism, and it certainly doesn't correspond to the current one. What we do see as the way that capitalism solves its own problems or reaches some kind of functionality is that it uses all the resources, or it tries to use all the resources at its disposal, which include state intervention as one of those resources in the structuring of markets and the structuring of world division of labor, in order to find a viable setting in which to generate and appropriate the surplus value that David Harvey talked about. I think we have a pretty good idea of some of the dimensions. I think Prabhat Patnaik's description of the current situation as a kind of impasse is on the mark. And there are very different ways that the system might regain functionality. I think it's very important for us to think really hard, critically, as Harry said about studying the financial system, that there are really a lot of open choices as to how we might restore some level and some kind of functionality to the world economic system, and those choices may have very, very different consequences for different large groups of people, regionally, in terms of class, and in gender, and in other dimensions.
Yeah, rather than think about the American order, I think right now it's more appropriate to think of shifting hegemonic structures in the global economy. Because I think there is a good deal of instability in the power structures, and you've got the emergence of regional hegemons, if you like. And the reorientation of a lot of structures of world trade. For instance, the China trade in Latin America has increased tenfold in about 10 years. To the degree that places like Brazil and Chile, before the earthquake, were coming out of the crisis, had everything to do with the China trade and its the changing orientation. And of course, power structures are shifting. And I think it's increasingly difficult, and it has been since the 1970s, to talk very coherently about national economies. I mean, that's precisely the point about financialization. But I would like to point out, if you go back and read Giovanni Arrighi, financialization in the global economy is nothing new. In fact, I mean, he uses the argument, I think it's a little too simplistic, but it's the argument that periods of financialization always precede hegemonic shifts. And that is for a very simple reason, that to finance capital in this country, in the same way that it screwed the British, so it connived at the deindustrialization of the United States. So to the degree that the US has been deindustrialized has a lot to do with the operations of Wall Street, and this kind of these kinds of shifts are going on. So I think that it's rather think of it as a simple version of imperial power, which does exist and does take measures like Obama escalating in Afghanistan and all those sorts of things, and there's a geopolitics to that. It's not the only thing that's going on. That geopolitical world is also paralleled by, if you like, this more, what I call molecular motion that is pushing to create different power structures in different parts of the world with different opportunities. I mean, capitalism not only shifts around the crisis from one kind of form, from a sort of an excess power of labor, for example, to an effective demand crisis of the sort we have now, it also shifts it around geographically. And the uneven geographical development of the crisis is something that we didn't get time to talk about. I have 2 chapters on it in the new book, but it's a very difficult thing to track because there's a great deal of contingency there, which makes it almost impossible for any government to have a coherent policy which is going to stick, because you don't know what everybody else is going to do, and you don't know what's going to happen in the different spaces of the world economy. And we see again and again and again investments made in this place which just don't do anything because something happened in that place. So this is, if you like, where I would prefer to look at it as a systemic kind of problem.
I would reiterate the notion that the system, left to its own devices, is only very weakly self-regulating and so prone to instability. But now connect up to some of the previous comments. And I would agree that the decline in importance of the nation state, link that with the globalization of finance. Yes, that's right. Which leaves us with this weakly self-regulating, instability-prone system. The direct question that was asked to me was about sort of finance capital and underinvestment. I maybe use a different, more Keynesian language to describe this. I think in this kind of system, the problem is liquidity preference. Okay, that the only protection you have against the instability of the system is accumulating money balances to the extent you can. And the problem, however, is that it's an inside credit system. And so your money balances are someone else's liabilities. So it's quite impossible for us all to be creditors. And I do see in that regard, I mean, it is true that this is financial crisis is part of a much larger issue that has to do with the globalization of finance. But I would say that the rise of the shadow banking system was not just driven by profit-seeking financiers downtown, but in fact was trying to solve a problem. There was a problem that it was solving, and now that solution is no longer on the cards, the problem is still there, and it was generating a lot of money balances outside of the United States, and right now we've put that onto the balance sheet of Obama, of the U.S. government largely, but that's just a holding action.
Just a few responses to the questions put to me and one general comment. Yes, the hegemony of the United States predates the emergence of international finance capital. As you know, post-Second World War period was marked by Pax Americana, and that is also what characterized the Bretton Woods system. But on the other hand, the emergence of international finance capital comes later, much later. In fact, with it is associated the decline of Keynesian demand management. The second question that was put to me is about delinking. The capitalist classes in countries like India and elsewhere are not interested in delinking. In other words, I think what globalization has produced is a deep division, a deep hiatus within societies like India and so on, which in the anti-colonial struggle, you had the domestic bourgeoisie along with the peasants, workers, and so on, as part of the general anti-colonial struggle. That is ruptured. And as a result, the bourgeoisie is completely committed to the kind of globalization that's going on and which is dispossessing peasants and squeezing them. The third question which was put to me was about this peasantry. Yes, I agree that, that the assimilation of the peasantry into the workforce. Incidentally, there's a lot of mythology about the assimilation of the peasantry into the workforce, even within the advanced countries, because let us not forget that, 50 million Europeans migrated to the New World in the 19th century. So it's not as if the dispossessed peasants were all assimilated into the proletariat. A lot of them, in fact, had the opportunity of going and settling in the new territories, which does not exist today. And in any case, as I was arguing, the rate of growth of demand for labor is such that dispossessed peasants cannot be assimilated into the proletariat, even in rapidly growing third world economies. And that is something which actually makes a kind of struggle against the existing order even more essential. Finally, I just want to say that I think Duncan raised this very, very important and interesting point that, that a crisis does not produce a revolution. It's not necessarily good for the left. And likewise, a crisis does not mean also that, that capitalism is going to collapse. An impasse doesn't mean a collapse of capitalism. What it does is that it actually sets up a whole unfolding conjuncture in which all kinds of possibilities exist. The Second World War was, in a certain sense, a sequel to the Great Depression. The Great Depression was not resolved, and in fact got to be resolved, in the sense of unemployment disappearing only with the war. But then that in turn opened up an enormous scope for historical change, so that it's not the Depression alone that brought about this change, but the sequel to the Depression in the form of an unfolding conjuncture. Now, to the extent the current crisis, in my view, is going to be a protracted one, it might actually also give rise to such an unfolding, protracted conjuncture in which all kinds of historical possibilities would open up.
It's an amazingly rule-abiding as well as erudite panel. Well, the point is not merely to understand the world, but to change it. Please go and change it. Please join me in warmly thanking our speakers.